LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Ponio Giannopoulos.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the surprising science of human goodness. So, Ponio, you and I have known each other for at least a decade now. A question I've been interested to ask, do you think of yourself as a cynic?
I would consider myself a lapsed cynic. I used to be cynical, and then I've been working on it, trying to become more optimistic. And I would ask you the same question, but I know all too well from experience, you are by far the most optimistic person I have ever met. And that includes when my son was 4 years old and thought the world was, rainbows and puppies.
Oh my gosh. I've only recently graduated from just putting everything that I see in my mouth. I definitely consider myself an optimist, but specifically when it comes to other people, interpersonal dynamics, I think of myself as being somewhat more skeptical when I think about sort of how the world works, the systems through which the world operates. But let me tell you, the reason I ask you this question, Ponio, is that this week on the show, you sat down with Jamil Zaki, who runs the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. And he's got a new book out, a lot of people are talking about, called Hope for Cynics. Let's give our listeners a little taste. What is this book all about?
It's a fascinating book. As soon as I saw the title, I thought, this one's for me, right? So it looks at why so many of us feel like the world kind of sucks these days and that people are getting meaner and trust is way down and everyone's self-interested. But as it turns out, that perception is off. There's all this research showing that people are often way more decent and generous than we give them credit for. And it's a long, fascinating dive into the world of kindness and empathy and cynicism and optimism and skepticism. But really what it comes down to is this idea of hopeful skepticism, which is not about pretending everything's fine, but being real about the problems that are going on, but still believing in people and acting in a way to make things better and more hopeful and, for lack of a better word, kinder.
This is a very important message, I think. And for that reason, this book was one of our 2 winners for the current season of the Next Big Idea Club, which is a huge honor, right? We pick 2 books a quarter, 8 books a year as winners out of all the nonfiction books that are published. Do you want to tell our listeners a little more about the book club?
Sure. So, as you said, we pick 8 books, but we look at hundreds of books to narrow down the top sort of most groundbreaking must-read nonfiction titles. And these are books written by prize-winning journalists, academics, like real heavyweights in their fields, and they're exploring topics in social science and business, psychology, health, and wellness. So we pick these nonfiction books and we send them to our subscribers.
We also host live Q&As, live video conversations with these heavyweight authors so our members can interact with them directly, ask them questions, discuss their books. And you and your team, Ponio, create these extraordinary reading guides. And we also interview these authors on the show.
And as it happens, we'll be announcing our newest winners in the next couple of days.
Maybe, Ponio, you and I can come back on the show and make that announcement together. We can share who the finalists are and who the 2 winners will be this season.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great idea. I don't think we've ever done that before.
Yep, this would be a first. And I'm really looking forward to this. Let's do it. And I'm also looking forward to your conversation with Jamil Zaki, which we'll hear after this break.
AI moves fast, and the path forward isn't always clear. Cisco gives you the infrastructure, security, and insights to stay the course. Cisco, making AI work for you. Visit cisco.com/AI.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Jamil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Panio. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm really excited to have you as a guest because I will admit that while I'm not a full-blown cynic, certainly not after reading your book, I have had real cynical tendencies in the past. So maybe we could talk a little bit just right off the bat about why is cynicism so appealing to people?
Happy to talk about that. I really appreciate you sharing as well. And if you don't mind me opening with a question, what do you think has drawn you to cynicism in those moments where you've felt like you've lost faith, for instance, in other people?
Well, okay, so one thing is there's certainly this tendency to think that cynicism is a kind of an intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. You look around and you're seeing, oh, well, bad things happen and this happens and that happens. And, the wrong people get ahead and, self-interest seems to predominate. So if you're not cynical, then you're being kind of a sucker. In fact, I remember when I graduated from college, my girlfriend at the time, her mother and father gave me a card. And I was moving to New York City. I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I was very sort of naive and hopeful. And they gave me a writer and it said, "An optimist enters the world." And it shows this guy with wearing what might be a dunce cap, it's a little painful, is about to walk off a cliff onto all these like jagged spikes. And I remember thinking like, whoa, is that me? Like, this is the first time like somebody else had portrayed me as sort of a bumbling, kind of naive innocent. And then 20 years later, when I thought back to that card, I thought, God, I would never consider myself that way. I'm so skeptical or even cynical. So I think a lot of people equate, and I certainly did, I would equate optimism with a lack of knowledge, like a lack of knowing like how the world really works.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's a heck of a card to give somebody on a momentous occasion like their college graduation.
I think they were just trying to be funny. They were sweet, but yeah, it kind of misfired. Yeah.
Well, but it also captures, I think, what you're correctly identifying as a prevailing notion, not just in that card, but in our entire culture, which is that if you have a positive view of human beings, that just means that you haven't been around the block enough times. It means that you haven't accrued enough wisdom. There's this sense that the more that we know, the more experience we have with other people, the less faith we have in them. In fact, this is what's known as the cynical genius illusion, right? So people, if you tell them about somebody who's optimistic and somebody who's very pessimistic and cynical, they tend to act as though that optimist is wearing a dunce cap on their way to drop on some stalactites, right? They predict that a cynic will do better at cognitive tests than a non-cynic, and that cynics would be socially smarter, for instance, better able to tell who's lying and who's telling the truth. The reason that we call that the cynical genius illusion is because it's just not true. In fact, cynical people tend to do less well on cognitive tests and have a harder time figuring out who's lying and who's telling the truth, which then begs the question, why do we think cynicism is so smart? Why do we have this view in our culture? And I think one reason is because of what cynicism and hope cause us to do. The hopeful person takes a risk on somebody else. Maybe they do that over and over again. And maybe at some point they are betrayed. Maybe at some point they do feel like a sucker. Somebody does do wrong by them. Those errors are so easy for us to spot and to point out and to make fun of. A cynic, though, more often withdraws. They don't trust people. They don't take chances on them. And so the mistakes that they make are invisible because you can tell and remember if you've been betrayed. But when you lose a chance to make a friend or build a partnership, those losses are invisible. So I think that in a way, the mistakes that non-cynics make are just louder than the mistakes that cynics make. And that causes us to have this bias to imagine that cynicism is smart even when it's not.
That's really interesting, right? So the costs of cynicism are hidden in a lot of ways, right? We don't see the thing the person doesn't try. We don't see the goal they give up on because they don't think it's going to happen or they think no one's going to help them.
Exactly. You never know the friend you didn't make. You don't mourn the love that you could have had but chose not to invest in, right? These are invisible to us, but they cost us enormously over the long term. Cynicism, this unwillingness to have faith in other people, this belief that in general people are selfish, greedy, and dishonest, tracks all sorts of negative outcomes over the course of a person's life, but it whittles away at us slowly. And I think because of that, it's harder to see its dangers.
In your research, do you find that cynicism or optimism, and I'm kind of using them as, poles, but are they innate? Some people seem to just be optimistic, whereas other people just, are kind of Eeyores and they're down and they're cynical. And it doesn't seem like necessarily that many bad things have happened to get them to that place. They were there, and then it's kind of a self-reinforcing position.
It's true. And you bring up Eeyores. I think the Winnie the Pooh cinematic universe already gives us cases of cynics and non-cynics and acts as though these are different species almost of people, right? And so there is this intuition that maybe this is just something that we can't change about ourselves. It turns out that there's a bunch of research on this. For instance, people examine identical and fraternal twins and look at their levels of optimism and cynicism to see, well, if identical twins are closer to each other than fraternal twins, even though they've all been raised in similar environments, maybe that's a genetic source of that worldview. And it turns out that the best estimates we have are that approximately a quarter of a person's optimism and a quarter of their cynicism is genetic or heritable, which is, a fair chunk, but it leaves most of it to be determined not by our genes, but by our environment. And there's a bunch of evidence as well that the type of environment that we're in, both in our family life and also in our workplaces, for instance, can shift us over time into becoming more hopeful or more cynical versions of ourselves. So even though there's a genetic component here, that doesn't mean that we're fixed in place. It doesn't mean that we can't do anything to change the way that we view the world.
On one hand, that's reassuring. But on the other hand, it sounds like it's very much environmental versus kind of self-motivated, right? So if I want to be more optimistic, but if the environment plays such a huge part of it, how am I optimistic if I'm in a place that kind of squashes that?
I think that's a really good and important question. And I do think that, individuals' ability to change is constrained sometimes by the environment that they're in. I mean, imagine that you are in a town, some mythical, horrible town where everybody's truly is very competitive, unfriendly, and even cruel. Well, you could want to have faith in people all day long, but if you're not getting evidence that that's safe, that that's wise, that that's appropriate in that situation, well, then it stands to reason that it would be very difficult for you to trust or have hope in people. Likewise, I mean, I know this is a tough example, but people who are in abusive households, who are facing real trauma, well, it's very difficult for those people to establish trust, and it makes all the sense in the world that that would be difficult for them. I think a lot of the times personal development, trying to change who we are, isn't just a matter of optimizing as individuals. It's a matter of shifting our communities, trying to find a social world that suits who we want to be. I think that certainly the environment can place constraints on us, but we can change our environments as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind because it can be discouraging. I mean, a lot of the books we read at the Next Big Idea Club have an element of personal development, usually backed in science, and a lot of the responsibility gets shouldered by the person, right? The person says, I'm going to be more productive, I'm going to be more this and that. And sometimes it's easy to overlook the fact that you are part of a system, whether it's a family, whether it's a community, a work community, and you can't just do whatever you want, no matter how good your intentions are. There are constraints. But I am curious about the idea of how inequality fosters cynicism, like on a bigger social scale. And again, I know that's a huge question, but well, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, no, I really resonate with the point you're making as well. I mean, I'm a psychologist. I focus on people generally one at a time, right? I'm interested in what happens in our minds and how we can change what's happening in our minds. Therapy, likewise, tends to be a single serving version of human change. And so I sympathize with that perspective. But as you're saying, we are not in a vacuum, right? We are not islands. We are deeply connected to one another. And the way that we tend to change has a lot to do with our environment. And one of the features of our environment increasingly these days is inequality, as you mentioned. It turns out that people have been becoming steadily more cynical, at least in the US, over the last 50 years. So, for instance, in 1972, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted. But by 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans. And in trying to pinpoint why did that occur, one potential culprit is the rise in inequality. It turns out that if you look across space and across time, inequality is one of the strongest predictors of cynicism and low trust. So for instance, more unequal nations around the world tend to be less trusting. More unequal states within the US tend to have people who trust each other less. And over time, places that become more unequal become more cynical, and places that become less unequal tend to become more trusting. And you might think, well, in an unequal environment, people who have less, who are relatively poor, have every reason not to trust other people. But it turns out that in unequal environments, wealthy people also are less trusting of others. And I think that one of the reasons for this is that when things are highly unequal, that tends to put people in a zero-sum mentality, right? That if only a few people can really make it in a culture, well then, every time somebody else makes it, it's a little bit less likely that you will. And if you have that zero-sum view, well, everybody becomes a competitor and an enemy instead of a collaborator and friend.
That's a little overwhelming, to be honest, because it doesn't seem like right now we're tracking towards more equality or we're tracking towards more support, more community. It seems we're growing more divisive. And I'm speaking as, as an American, but also just kind of in the world in general, we're moving more and more towards inequality. How is this going to get turned around?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. And I too see the trends that you're describing. I mean, I don't know that I have a solution for how we're going to turn around inequality, except to say that we should be aware of the different ways that it's hurting us. We should know and use the best evidence available to understand what we want as a culture. And it turns out that if you ask a lot of people for their viewpoints, especially if you don't tag a policy as either Democratic or Republican, people across the aisle, across the spectrum in the US, tend to favor policies that are more egalitarian. For instance, expanding pre-kindergarten or the social safety net in various ways. So people are surprisingly supportive of policies that help all of us. And I think that's one piece of evidence that gives me a little bit of hope. But I think you're exactly right that sometimes our culture, broadly speaking, seems to be trending in more cynical directions. That's why oftentimes I tell people to think globally but hope locally, to focus on their close communities, on their local communities. And it turns out that if you look at people's views of human beings in general, we tend to be pretty bleak and cynical. But if you ask people about the folks who they come into regular contact with, not just their friends, but their neighbors, their grocer, their bus driver, their kid's third grade teacher, we trust those people. The closer that we get to other human beings, the more we tend to like them, the more that we see the good in them. And I think that that's tragic because increasingly we're interacting online where we don't really encounter each other as humans. But I think there's good news here as well, which is that if we can refocus on real one-on-one connections, well, trust and hope kind of bounce back a little bit more naturally.
That's great advice. I do find, from my experience, I'm fairly introverted, and ordering online is, one of the greatest inventions for introverts, right? I don't have to have an awkward conversation with anyone. I don't even, it just gets left at my door. But recently I went to Barnes & Noble to buy a notebook because I thought, I wake up every morning and I look at my phone, and all these studies say that it's not a great way to start your day, right? A little bit of a mini digital detox. So I thought, I'm just going to write down my to-do list and my sort of goals every morning, and then I'll have it. So I drove to Barnes & Noble. I bought the book. And as I'm buying the notebook, this bright red notebook, a stranger says to me, "Oh, where'd you find that?" Just asking where the notebooks are. And I said, "Oh, it's right over there." And then I don't know why, I guess maybe she's an extrovert. She said, "Oh, what are you using it for?" And I told her, I said, "Well, I mean, since you asked," and I explained what I just explained to you. She said, "Oh, I've been thinking about doing that. My kids have been telling me, So we just sort of chatted for a minute or two, complete stranger, just talking about notebooks, couldn't be nerdier. And honestly, it was probably the highlight of my day. In this very simple, weird way, this moment of connection. And I thought, even if I were online and for some reason I posted like, "Hey, look at my new notebook, gonna go analog," ironically, and somebody, posted, "Hey, me too," that does not equate to a face-to-face conversation with someone, just a friendly chat. And I don't know, even now, it was a week ago, it stuck with me. Even while I've sort of neglected my notebook, by the way, I'm back to my phone, so I slipped. I still think of that conversation, and I thought that was just such a nice moment. And so that gets back to this idea of that, we are suspicious or we're cynical of people's motives, and yet this was just a generally nice, friendly conversation with a stranger in my community with no agenda on anyone's part. It was just hello. And I think the more of those interactions you can have, the more it reinforces this idea that, most people in general just kind of want to get by. They're not, they're not looking to exploit you every day.
That's right. And yet we strenuously avoid interactions like this more than we used to, right? There's an ad, I think it was for DoorDash in the New York City subway a few years ago, that said, 8 million people in New York, and we help you avoid every one of them.
It's a clever ad.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that we do, as a culture, especially with the use of technology, we have allowed ourselves to kind of to recede from social contact. And I think that a lot of us, I myself, Panio, am also an introvert. Ironic given that I talk to people for a living, but secretly I am pretty introverted and I do prefer alone time. And I have a lot of inertia when it comes to socializing, whether that's striking up a conversation with a stranger, going to a cocktail party, whatever. I tend to I love a canceled plan, put it that way.
I think that's the real test of an introvert, by the way. How do you react when plans get canceled? If you light up, you're an introvert.
Yes, a little celebration. But, I think that I've come to recognize how that is actually a soft form of cynicism, how I underestimate the value of connecting with other people because I underestimate what they will be like and also how connected we will feel in a conversation. And I'm not alone. There's a ton of research on this from Nick Epley and other folks where they ask people to predict what a social situation would feel like. What would it be like if you struck up a conversation with a stranger at the bookstore, for instance, about your notebook? Or what would it be like if you opened up to a new friend about a struggle that you're going through? Or expressed gratitude to somebody who's helped you? Or try to do a favor for somebody? In all of these cases, people predict that these experiences would be pretty cringe, for lack of a better term, right? That they'd be awkward, it wouldn't be that positive, they wouldn't feel that connected to the person. And Nick and his colleagues have a separate group of people in all of these studies actually go and do that thing. Take that chance on somebody else. Take that little leap of faith into the social world. And then they ask them, well, how was that? And invariably, people think that these situations will be awkward, and then they're actually wonderful. So when we take that jump, like you did in the bookstore, we often end up thinking, wow, that was maybe the best interaction that I had today or even this week. And yet we keep on avoiding those very interactions. So I think one tool of anti-cynicism, of trying to fight cynicism and reconnect with people, is to be aware of these biases and to swim upstream against them. I'm not saying this is easy. I think it's quite difficult, actually. But for me, for instance, I tried to make a point now, since working on this book, to strike up more conversations than I feel like having, and to also note, maybe in a bright red notebook, how positive those interactions have been so that I can remember that and use that as fuel for trying to reconnect with people or connect with new people in the future.
That's wonderful. And you also talk about the idea of adopting a stance of hopeful skepticism, which I think is an appealing kind of middle ground, right? Because some people, optimism is just too far away, right? It's too extreme. It feels too, just careless, for lack of a better word. So how would you define hopeful skepticism, and how is that different than, ordinary skepticism?
Yeah, well, you know from the book that I myself struggle with cynicism quite a bit. And I think that the description you just gave of optimism being just too far away resonates with me personally quite deeply, right? I just don't think that I really could be an optimist. I think the world is just too complicated for that. But I would also add, Panio, that I don't think I want to be an optimist. And I wouldn't just necessarily recommend that to other people either. Think about it. A cynic is absolutely sure that they know what people are like. And if you know that people are terrible, well, you probably also know that the future is going to be kind of terrible as well, because so much of the future depends on what we decide to do with it. An optimist is also sure about what's going to happen. They're sure that people are great and things are going to turn out well. I think both of them are wrong. I think that both of these perspectives, in fact, and I don't want to sound too insulting here, have what I would call epistemic arrogance. The belief that you know something that you can't possibly know. You can't possibly know what everybody's like, and you can't possibly know what the future holds. Skepticism, then, is a viewpoint that acknowledges that. It's a scientific way of thinking where you don't start with the assumption that people are great, or that people are terrible, or that the future will be great, or that the future will be terrible. You sit in uncertainty, and you look for evidence to figure out who you can trust or what you think will happen in a particular situation. Hopeful skepticism is then taking that same scientific mindset and adding to it a recognition that oftentimes our default mode is too negative. We often underestimate other people in these systematic ways. And that means that when we pay closer attention, when we think like scientists, instead of starting with a conclusion and trying to defend it, well, when we do that, pleasant surprises will be everywhere. People will often be better than we realize.
That's inspiring, and it seems manageable, which is nice.
I hope so. And again, I think of skepticism as manageable personally. It's something that I have been able to cultivate because, well, I am a scientist, and I'm used to making predictions about the world and then testing them through research. And I've tried ever since starting to work on Hope for Cynics to live a little bit more like a scientist as well. If I find myself coming to a really bleak conclusion about the future or saying, oh, I don't think anybody can be trusted, I ask myself, wait a minute, Zaki, that's a huge claim. How would you defend that if you were trying to test it scientifically? And I find oftentimes my cynicism is overreaching. It's going far beyond the evidence. And so then I ask myself, well, what evidence could you collect? Panio, having that conversation with that person in that bookstore was a little piece of evidence, wasn't it? It was a little piece of data. Instead of going and ordering something online, you went into the world and you learned something, right? And the question is, can we use that data that we collect to update our expectations, maybe to update them to be a little bit more trusting and a little less cynical?
So if I have a bias towards cynicism, what's a practical step I can take to kind of pull back from that cynicism? Just like a baby step. Like, what do I do?
Yeah, again, I think that what I would describe as a great first step would be fact-checking your cynicism, right? So again, the next time that you find yourself thinking in a cynical way, try to figure out whether that viewpoint is justified. Do you have evidence to defend this claim that you're making? Would you be able to support that claim if somebody challenged you and said, why do you believe that, right? So I think that having a more questioning perspective, being skeptical of our cynicism is a great first step, right? And it doesn't take doing anything differently. It just takes being aware of the biases in our minds.
That's interesting. It reminds me in a way, it's different, but it does remind me in a way of meditation, right? Where a thought comes up and they say, just let your thought pass, let it be.
Mm-hmm.
Don't judge it. It's not good or it's not bad. Although I suppose in your case, we are kind of, if not judging, we're examining it, right?
Yes.
So a thought pops up. Instead of just assuming, well, that's got to be right. Well, why? Because it's in my head. There's lots of stuff in my head. It can't all be right. There's contradictory stuff in my head. So I have a thought and I think, oh, nothing ever works out for me. Or this, you can't trust anyone these days. And then you stop and you think, okay, is there any counter evidence? Is there any evidence for this thought at all? And then more explicitly, is there anything that just immediately refutes it?
I love that perspective. And I do think that there's a deep connection between anti-cynicism and meditation. And also, you brought up this, maybe a claim that we might have in our mind that, oh, nothing ever works out for me, right? That's also pretty similar to what you see among people who are suffering from depression, right? Depression and anxiety fill our minds with these extremely confident, very broad predictions about ourselves and the world. And cognitive therapy, one of the most effective ways to treat those conditions, is basically being mindful and aware and asking, wait a minute, just because this thought is in my head doesn't mean that I have to believe it. I don't have to believe the depression. My anxiety is not necessarily correct. And being a little bit more scientific and more mindful. And again, when I talk about anti-cynicism here, I'm not talking about just looking on the bright side or imagining a broad, untestable positive thing about the world. I'm just talking about paying closer attention. And oftentimes, again, when we pay close attention, it turns out that things are better than we think because our default setting tends to be so cynical.
The future with AI is moving fast, but progress takes more than speed. It takes direction. Cisco gives you the infrastructure, security, and insights to implement AI with purpose, from data centers to workplaces. We don't just help you keep up, we help you lead. Cisco, making AI work for you. Visit cisco.com/AI. That's cisco.com/AI.
So in your research, have you found any insights that help with something like managing our online presence or social media? Because you mentioned in the book that social media often contributes to cynicism. So are there any guidelines you suggest for sort of a healthier online engagement? Should we just scrap the whole thing and delete our accounts?
I have to say that my first tip when people ask me about how to be less cynical online is always just to spend less time online. I'm
it's
afraid
like, how do I drink less poison? Well, maybe just put the glass of poison down.
What's the right number of cigarettes to smoke every morning, right? It's probably 0, frankly. Look, it's just true that online platforms have generally been built to keep us online, to appeal to whatever grabs our attention. And human beings have something called negativity bias, which means that we pay way more attention to harmful and threatening information than to the good stuff. And I get it. I mean, it feels safe to know about all the threats in our environment. It seems like a way to protect ourselves. And it probably helped us survive hundreds of thousands of years ago to pay attention to everything that was scary around us. But the problem is that this hyper-modern media ecosystem feeds us just that, right? So the more that we are online, the more that we feel that humanity is terrible, the more that we feel that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, right? This is what's known as mean world syndrome. The more media that you consume, the meaner you think the world is. And you might say, well, yeah, because people are more informed, right? If you're watching the news, then you know how bad things are. But it's even true that people who pay lots of attention to media are wrong in really systematic ways. For instance, the people who post most online about politics are not representative of most people. They tend to be way more extreme, way more outraged, and way more negative. So what that means is that if you spend a lot of time online, and especially you don't interact with people you disagree with in person, but only see them on Twitter, for instance, you will end up with a systematically skewed version of who's on the other side of a disagreement. When you try to imagine the average person you disagree with, you'll think of this extreme online troll who's nothing like the actual average. So in that way, life online is not just making us miserable, it's making us more wrong about one another. So I realize that the answer that I've given is just log off. I think there is another approach as well, which is to try to balance our media diet. You know, there are some great websites. Like one of them is the Solutions Journalism Network. Another is Reasons to be Cheerful. And these are websites that cover real problems, right? Like climate change and inequality, but they cover them not just in terms of talking about how bad everything is, but also by talking about people who are trying to make a positive difference when it comes to those issues. So these are not fluff stories, right? It's not like a squirrel got rescued by a crocodile. Well, though that would be very interesting if that happened.
I would watch that.
I would too, frankly. Yeah, we can watch it together. But these are stories about real positive change. And so what I try to do when I go online and I read about some horrible thing, some horrible news story, is to go to the Solutions Journalism Network and look up that same topic to try to balance and know, yes, there are huge problems, but there are also people around the world trying to make a difference in addressing those problems too.
That's encouraging. And because I do think that there's a tendency when we get discouraged, right, by everything we're seeing online to say, okay, well, I'm going, show me a picture of a squirrel being rescued or an otter, swimming and holding hands with another, these sort of adorable things, but they don't really accomplish anything. Just for a moment, they distract you from the stuff, but it doesn't really resolve that anxiety or tension about what's going on in the world, the bigger picture. So somebody who's actually making some progress, some forward positive progress, is probably more effective at balancing us out.
I agree. And the idea that the only good news is a squirrel or, an otter holding hands, that's plugs right into the narrative that the truth is bad, that cynicism is wisdom, and that feeling positive is just burying your head in the sand, right? That the only good news comes Friday at the very end of the news broadcast, and it's fluff. And now we can get back to reality on Monday and realize how terrible everything is. That's again, this cynical narrative that only negativity is true and that only negative people are wise. And I think that the data simply don't back that up.
So when you first went into your research, you mentioned you were kind of a secret cynic.
Mm-hmm.
Did you, I know you're open-minded because you are a scientist, but were you surprised by the findings? Did you think, well, this is going to be a tough one to sell because nobody wants to read a book about cynicism prevailing?
I was surprised. I think that it's interesting because, as you know, I have sort of two perspectives on this. One is the science that I've been doing for 20 years, which tends to focus on human connection and empathy and kindness. And that science has given me a deep perspective on how good people can be, how kindly we can treat each other, how connected we want to be, and how connected we often are. And then my personal perspective as a secret cynic, as you rightly pointed out, was to just kind of feel differently than that. And here again, I noticed a discrepancy between what I know as a scientist and what I feel as a person. And that, I think, is the cynical bias in a nutshell. That even if you give people all sorts of evidence, their default is to say, well, I still want to be safe. I want to be wise. And the only way to do that is to expect the worst, right? That's the way for me to look smart. It's the way for me to avoid betrayal and to get what I need out of life, right? So I feel this bias in me, right? And the work on the book, from my perspective, was a process of trying to get the science that I knew to actually stick with me as a human being. And that's an ongoing process. I don't think of myself as an ex-cynic. I think of myself as a cynic in recovery.
That's great. Well, I have to ask, do you have children?
Yes.
So speaking from experience, I have 3 kids, but they're all kind of older now, 21 and 2 15-year-olds. But I will say that for me, becoming a parent was a sort of optimism reboot, or a hope reboot, where suddenly you've got this little baby, obviously depends on you for everything. But not just that, as your child grows and develops and starts to learn about the world and walks and talk, their hope and their curiosity and their excitement, not to gush like a new parent, but it is infectious, right? It's this and you start thinking, right, like here's another chance to interact with the world, to discover the world. And they're not jaded yet. I've never met a jaded 3-year-old. I can't imagine how that would happen. But all that said, that's the happy part of the story, right?
Yeah.
You have kids. Right. Ideally, they kind of, Christmas means something, or holidays mean something, or presents are fun again. And, just seeing a dog is a highlight of the day. But then as your child gets older, you have a responsibility to prepare them for the dangers of the world too, right? And the realities of the world. And this is where I feel like that cynicism starts to creep back as your kid gets older. So for parents, I'm sure you talk with parents in your research. How do you encourage your kids to be optimistic or be hopeful without making them naive or vulnerable or unsafe?
Yeah, this is a huge question. And first of all, I love your perspective. I think you're right that having kids is a anti-cynicism reboot, right? You see the beauty of the world all over again. It's like it's like putting contact lenses in for the first time, and you see the sort of shimmering quality of the light around you. I mean, it's just such a gorgeous experience. But you're also right that what floods in along with that beauty and that love is fear, at least if you're anything like me. I mean, I remember sort of when my daughters were born, sort of having this flip in my sense of self that I was a protector now, that's one of my, and I still, if I ask my kids, what's my most important job? They say, to keep us safe, right? And that is, I mean, I think that a lot of parents would see themselves in that role. So how do we keep our kids safe? Well, researchers asked parents, hundreds of parents, a couple of years ago, what do you think your kid should believe about the world in order to succeed? And they found that most parents believe that their kids should think the world is unsafe and competitive, right? Not cooperative. And as a parent, I totally get why you would want your kids to feel that way. If your kids think the world is unsafe, maybe then they'll be safer because they'll avoid harm and danger. Here's the problem. When we teach our kids the world is unsafe, what are we also instilling in them? Cynicism, right?
Exactly.
And it turns out that these same researchers interviewed adults and they found that adults who believe that the world is unsafe and competitive do worse in terms of their happiness, their mental health, and their professional lives. So in the service of trying to protect our kids and keep them safe, we're teaching them that the world is unsafe in a way that actually can limit their opportunities and limit the scope of their lives, which I think is frankly tragic. I completely understand why parents would do that. We're well-intentioned, but we often end up seeding our kids with a perspective that will hurt them in the long run.
It makes sense. You're right on every level. And sometimes I'll even notice I'll get pushback from my kids, sort of course correct, like, settle down, Dad. Like, not everyone's a monster. Not everyone's like, but it's true because of course, you're very much our first job, I think most parents would feel, is to, protect our kids. But it is sad to think you're accidentally impairing or constraining their futures too.
Yeah, and younger generations are far more anxious and far more cynical than older generations. And I'm not saying that parenting and parenting styles is the only reason for that. There's probably tons of reasons for that, but I'm not sure that we're helping by instilling this negative viewpoint. But I think there's a lot that we can do here. The first is to try to be really aware of what we are sharing with our kids. Actually, my own daughter called me on this a couple of years ago. I was driving her and her sister to school, and somebody cut us off in traffic, and I started, saying all sorts of things about this person. And she said, Dad, why are you not talking about the 1,000 people who didn't cut you off today?
Wow.
And so I think one tool that I would recommend is what's known as positive gossip. That is, each person in a family, kids included, can come up with one example of kindness or goodness that they saw that day and share it at the dinner table. This is a way to hedge against the cynicism that we might be instilling in our kids. It's not the same as telling our kids everybody is great and you can give your car keys to a stranger when you get older, right? We don't want our kids to be naive. We certainly don't want to put them in danger. But it's a way of balancing our perspective and saying, yeah, not everybody does great things all the time, but a lot of people are really wonderful. And then another thing that I think we can do much more of as parents is to put faith in our kids. Right? I think that I'm not speaking for you or me personally, but our generation of parents has restricted the freedom of kids in the analog world quite a bit, right? We let kids explore a lot less than we used to. And I think that's out of a sense of caution, but I think it also shows kids that we don't believe in them necessarily. So I think giving kids a little bit more room to explore and grow, although it's really hard as a parent and feels risky, is actually a lot less risky than most people think and has a huge upside in terms of helping kids believe in themselves and believe in the world around them.
I think that's a really good point, especially when it comes to that sense of an ability to solve your own problems, an ability to kind of handle any sort of, not any difficulty, but difficulties as they arise. I remember as a kid, we all talk about this from, Gen X and all that, about, you were just, it's sort of jokingly, we were neglected by our parents, the latchkey kids.
Latchkey, yeah.
But I would spend entire days unreachable, just wandering around the woods or just in town. I was fine. And what I learned from that is you just figure it out as you go. And so part of that sort of adaptable learning style has really receded, which is sad because the kids are just as capable. It's not like the next generation is, any less capable. They just don't necessarily have the opportunity.
So my older daughter is 9 and a half, actually. And when I was 10 or 11, I was a latchkey kid as well. And I would walk to and from school 2 miles each way, uphill both ways, Panyo, of course, in the snow.
In the snow.
No, but it was, and I would stop at the store on the way home. I would make myself food when I got home. I was just responsible for myself. And I really can't imagine giving my daughter that level of independence 1 year from now. And I don't really know how to feel about that, I mean, on the one hand, we live in a very different environment. We live in a big city, and I grew up in the suburbs. So I think there's lots of reasons that this might be different. But I also think that some of it is just, I don't feel comfortable with her having the freedom that I had. And I realize that that's probably not a defensible position. It's certainly what I feel. But if I try to say, well, why? I can't really come up with a great answer sometimes.
Well, again, I think these are communal, right? I mean, it's not like you're an outlier. You're right. Like, I would say yours is the default parental position. And very often, if you stray from it, you're going against the norm. I mean, the question is, how did this new norm happen? It's hard to say. I mean, I think part of it, this is pure speculation, by the way, but part of it could just be we're parenting in ways that we kind of wanted to be parented with a little more attention, maybe a little more oversight. Because I thought, well, it was a little, unwelcome to just feel like no one has any idea what I'm doing for hours. So we think, well, when I'm a parent, I'm going to be a little more on top of what my kids are doing. But then we sort of corrected too far and then forgotten that there's also a lot of joy and learning in just this sort of unstructured exploration.
I love that perspective. And it reminds me of something that was shared with me by really the protagonist of Hope for Cynics. This is my late friend, Emile Bruneau. He was a peace neuroscientist, just an inspirational guy all around, and one of the most hopeful people I ever knew. And so in the book, I tried to tell some of his story, and I asked him, years ago, where he had gotten his perspective from, where he had learned to be hopeful and, generally open to the world. And he talked a lot about his dad. And he said that his dad had this parenting style that Emile calls underbearing attentiveness. That is, he was totally present. He was always around. But he wasn't really ever trying to tell Emile what exactly he should do. He was letting Emile explore and discover who he wanted to be while always being there to support him if Emile wanted, right? So, Panyo, I guess I'm really hearing what you're saying of, we maybe wanted a little bit more attention, and we're trying to give that to our kids. And I think that's an incredibly noble and laudable instinct. But then the question is, can we balance that with underbearingness instead of overbearingness, right? Can we balance that with letting kids explore and discover who they are, as opposed to trying to, for lack of a better term, micromanage them into a safe and successful life?
Right. Switch from, I'm going to make everything perfect to, hey, I'm here if you need me.
Yes. Yeah. Much more succinct, Panyo, than what I was offering.
Well, I didn't have to come up with the idea. I just had to share it. So, first of all, everybody should read this book. So I absolutely loved it. And it was fun because I read it months and months ago. I read it back in the fall. I think I have my galley right here.
Oh, nice.
And then I also read it on my Kindle. And in preparing for this interview, I thought, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread it. And so much of it is underlined. I mean, all these really fascinating parts. That's always a good sign for me because I read a lot of books. And when I actually bust out the pen, that means it's connecting with me. But what I love about it is it reminds me of some of the other books that we've also picked in the past at the Next Big Idea Club, one of which, of course, is Rutger Bregman's Humankind, which stuck with me years later because he also confronts this prevailing and, frankly, destructive myth that at heart, philosophically, right, people are bad. People are selfish, they are exploitative, and the research which he presents in Humankind, and I hate to bring up another book, but it really does tie into yours very well, is that all these beliefs we have are actually not based in science. They're not even based in history, and that, in fact, most people default to a kind of a general kindness and cooperation.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, Humankind is one of my favorite books. And so I'm thrilled to talk about it. And I do think that Rutger Bregman and I are in a sort of conversation across these books. He is a historian, right? So he presents this perspective that actually, if you look through history, this claim that the Hobbesian claim that people are generally selfish and that we need society to rein us in, or else we would all murder each other, that just doesn't seem to be backed up in the historical record. The Dawn of Everything is another great book that I think makes a very similar case. And of course, I'm a psychologist. And so my take on this is not just these beliefs are misguided, which they are, but more, well, where do they come from? And what are they doing to us, right? I mean, I think that it's critical to understand not just that cynical beliefs are wrong, but that they are self-fulfilling. That when we think cynically about other people, we tend to treat them cynically, right? For instance, we tend to judge them more. We tend to try to, again, micromanage them more. We tend to threaten them or spy on them. And when we do those things, we actually bring out the worst of other people and then end up believing that we were right all along to be cynical, not realizing that we're the ones who generated the conditions for our beliefs to be confirmed. So I think that it's both really important to know that these beliefs are wrong and from a psychological perspective to be aware of how our beliefs shape our lives. I think a lot of us think of our beliefs as responses to the world. Something happens to me, so I believe X. In fact, a lot of the time, the causality goes the other way around. I believe something, and so I do something that produces a response. And I guess if there's, one message from the book, I think it's to take ownership over our beliefs and to understand that the way that we view the world and view each other will shape the lives that we live and the communities that we build, and that we have agency over choosing those beliefs and over living a life that is aligned with a more positive and accurate view of what other people are really like.
I couldn't agree more. And it's really empowering to think that these limiting beliefs are holding us back and they're not even accurate. I mean, that's so much of it to me. It's not like, oh, well, despite the negativity of the world, I'm still going to truck on and think the best of people. It's like, no, actually, I'm making it worse by thinking the worst of people.
Exactly. I often say that the data are better than our beliefs, better in two ways. Better because they're more accurate and better because they're more positive.
And perhaps this is a strange analogy, but I think sometimes about procrastination and action. It's very easy for me to procrastinate. And pretty much anyone says, well, motivation comes after action, which seems backwards, right? You think, oh, I can't wait to do it. And then you sit down and do it. In fact, if you just force yourself to sit down and do it, then you start feeling motivated. And so much of that seems to be proven out by research. And the same thing applies here with hope, right? You can't wait for these wonderful things to happen and then you'll feel hope. You just got to barrel ahead with hope, and then you'll start seeing all the data that supports it actually populating your life.
That's exactly right. And I think oftentimes the way that hope comes through in our actions is that we take chances on people, right? You can't wait to believe that people are great and then you'll start connecting more with strangers. You have to go into the world. You have to jump into the water and start connecting with people. And if you do that, then no guarantees here. Your mileage may vary, but by and large, you'll be pleasantly surprised by those experiences. And then hope and faith in other people will start to rise naturally within you, right? It's exactly as you're saying. It's what in clinical psychology is called behavioral activation, right? That you can't wait for your mind to change. Sometimes you need to do something first and let your mind catch up.
Right, because ultimately we are embodied in this world. I mean, we interact with the world. We're not just little brains just hanging out in a cocoon. I mean, everything we do in the world affects us.
That's right.
Jamil, thank you so much for joining me. This has really been wonderful. It's nice for two recovering cynics to chat and feel hopeful on a Monday afternoon.
Absolutely. And welcome to the Recovering Cynic Club, Panio. It's a pleasure to have you as part of it.
I'll share some little polar bear videos and some penguin videos to the group. I'll just send those along.
Wonderful.
Thank you again. And the book, for those who may have forgotten, Hope for Cynics, is fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Thanks so much. This has been delightful.
That was my colleague, Panio Giannopoulos, speaking with Stanford's Jamil Zaki. Panio, I just love that conversation. I'm ready to trim my negative news consumption and engage in some positive gossip.
Fantastic. Jamil and I will make you an honorary member of the Recovering Cynics Club.
Nice. I want in on those panda videos. If you'd like a copy of Jamil's book, along with the 7 other best nonfiction books of the year delivered straight to your door, consider becoming a Next Big Idea Club executive member. You can learn more at nextbigideaclub.com. And if you decide to pull the trigger, use code PODCAST at checkout to take 20% off your order. Today's show was produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Panio Giannopoulos.
See you next week.